Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are joined by Rabbi Moses Haber, and we are going to be looking at our first tshuva. I know, it's our first time doing a tshuva from Rav Ovadia Yosef here on the podcast. And of course, in the lead up to Pesach, what better topic to talk about than the Sephardic approach to Chametz on Pesach? Rabbi Moses Haber is a graduate of Yeshiva and Touro universities and holds master's degrees in education in social work. He is a licensed psychotherapist who is the founder and director of Makor, a faith-based spiritual support center for those in recovery from addictions, a unique center that aims to reduce the relapse rate using an integrated approach of spiritual and mental health modalities. He also sees a select group of clients privately. He is a rabbi at Sharei Shalom Congregation in Brooklyn, New York, and the rabbinic advisor of Golden Academy. I also have to give a shout out to longtime listener Nimrod Dayan, who made the shidduch and connected us. I went over to Nimrod, one of the members of our congregation and central member of our Sephardic minyan, and I said, I don't think I've had any Sephardic Rabbanim on the podcast yet. And I'm not exactly like the biggest proponent of DEI, but I thought we should get that kind of range on here, especially since we haven't done Chacham Ovadia yet. So I have to thank Nimrod Dayan. And Rabbi Haber, was a great suggestion. We're going to dedicate our learning today in memory of Rose Nuni Dayan, her neshama shavna aliyah, and the schus of our learning. So without any further ado, Rabbi Haber, we're going to be looking at a tshuva early on in Yechaveh Da'as from Rav Ovadia. I'm sure many of our listeners are at least generally familiar with Rav Ovadia Yosef, but as is our minhag, for the first time we're doing him on the podcast, maybe you could share just a little bit of biographical information, what we should be aware of about him, and then what is the particular shaila that he's dealing with in this tshuva.
First of all, Robert Kurtz, thank you for having me on your podcast. Shoot first, ask questions later. I'm really excited. We've been preparing for this for a while. And thank you for forcing me to look at the tshuva really, really carefully before Pesach starts so I can answer questions in the community. Chacham Ovadia Yosef, for me personally, and for members of the Sephardic congregation all around the world, was a leader who returned the crown of glory of Sephardic luster to our cultural approach. Extraordinary what he was able to do in his life. He was born in 1920, passed away in 2013. He was the chief rabbi from 1973 to 1983. He was in Egypt for a while, for a couple of years as the chief rabbi down there, but then returned really to lead not only the people of Israel, but all around the world in terms of the Sephardic approach and the nuanced approach based on the poskim, on a halachic approach. It's amazing that after he left the chief rabbinate in 1983 and 1984, he started the Shas organization. And if nobody knows what Shas stands for, it's Shomrei Sfarad. Shomrei Sfarad is, we need to make sure that we're serious about keeping our approach, our mesorah, our minhagim, and our halachic way of analyzing things. We need to keep it alive and we need to keep it going. And I would say he is the one who allows us to do that. He was writing Sephardim and shooting from the earliest age, from I think age 20 was his first book. And it's extraordinary what him and the entire family was able to give us in terms of the halachic corpus of material.
So what would make him different than the Ben Ish Chai? I understand that he kind of, I don't want to say like superseded. I'm sure that's a bit of a controversy there, but maybe you could just tell us briefly about how he's contrasted with the Ben Ish Chai in the Sephardic world.
It's a very superficial answer. There's very, very deep reasons that show how, first of all, extraordinarily respectful of the Ben Ish Chai, but he wrote a whole series of books called Halichot Olam that comment on each halacha of the Ben Ish Chai, showing that there's a different approach according to Chacham Ovadia's analysis. And I think what that shows us is that even within the Sephardic halachic analysis, there's multiple ways of viewing things. The simple reason that people give is the difference between them is the Ben Ish Chai was Kabbalistic and the Chacham Ovadia was not. That's just too simple for thinking people to accept. There was a different approach to halakha, and we know that even within Chacham Ovadia's own class and Purat Yosef, there were tremendous Talmidei Hachamim, and this is not a analysis of different approaches within the Sephardic approach, but who have different ways of being posek halakha.
Mm-hmm. Okay, definitely, worthy of its own analysis, but I understand we're going to be looking at Rav Ovadia Yosef's approach to issues of Chametz on Pesach. So what in particular, I mean, Chametz is a very broad topic. What's the particular shaila that we're looking at?
So the specific shaila is found in Yechaveh Da'as, Volume 1, Siman Yod Aleph, Siman 11. And the specific question, I'll read it now for you, but I believe it needs a lot of context, halacha context, to answer it, and I'm happy to do that as well. I'll tell you that before we even start the question, I'll tell you this is an extremely important halacha for Sephardi people living in Chutz La'aretz, living in let's say America, because the kashrut agencies in America, let's say the OU, are primarily run, maybe singularly run by Ashkenazim. And rice is not the only thing that differentiates Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Everybody says, "Oh, you can eat rice on Pesach," but what if I told you that the halakha that we're about to read has huge consequences in terms of the way that Sephardim and Ashkenazim approach Chametz on Pesach? What we're about to read is mind blowing in the depth of what it really means. So, growing up in Brooklyn, New York, and following all the kashrus agencies, and then learning this halakha as a young rabbi, we're like, wait a second, this allows us to do extraordinarily things on. We can't eat bread, cannot eat bread, but it's amazing that when you adopt a halachic approach to Chametz Pesach from a Sephardic perspective, this one halakha will say a lot, and there's a lot more that Chacham Ovadia writes after Yechaveh Da'as. He writes tshuvot in Yabia Omed. He writes tshuvot in Chazon Ovadia. He writes tshuvot in Halichot Olam. All of the books on Pesach speak about this in some way or another. The specific halacha question is the following: Ha'im mutar le'echol ba'Pesach hem'a o gvina? Are you allowed to eat butter or cheese on Pesach? Shena'asu kodem ha'Pesach. Essential point, that were manufactured before Pesach. V'lo hikpidu le'shomram, and they did not take care to watch when they were manufacturing the cheese and the butter. Be'ofen meuchad shiyu kisherim lePesach. That when they were in the manufacturing process, they didn't make sure that there was no chametz. V'chen dagim miluchim, and also salted fish, let's say sardines. Shenasu kodem haPesach, that were manufactured or cooked before the holiday of Pesach. Bili hashgacha miyuchedet. Right? Everybody knows when Pesach comes, the entire kitchen gets turned over, and there's a lot of hashgacha from the spouses to make sure that everything that enters the kitchen is non-chametz. But what if you prepared it and you did not have the hashgacha? He asks, Ha'im mutar le'echol mehem b'Pesach? Can you eat these things on Pesach? They were manufactured before Pesach. Can you eat them on Pesach?
Right. And I'm not the one who kind of clips out the coupons from the penny saver kind of person. But from what I understand, the prices on items in the lead up to Pesach begin to increase, even though it's the same item you could have bought before the lead up to Pesach. So the question is it really necessary to have this particular shmira, this particular kind of supervision on not such kosher LePesach sensitive products? That's the issue we're dealing with here.
Great question. That reminds me that I am not a posek, and I will not allow myself the freedom to tell anybody listening to this podcast in my name what's allowed or not allowed to do.
And we don't paskin halach on this podcast ever, I should say, but I appreciate it.
But it's an important thing because I don't want somebody to get the wrong idea. Of course, you'll put my contact information in the byline so anybody can ask me direct questions. But Yeah, it's a good question. Do we need to pay the extra cost? There shouldn't be an extra cost for sure. Nobody should take advantage of the fact that we want to be halachic Jews. But that's a good question. That's a good question, and maybe people will leave with a certain understanding. I think, but before we start talking about this specific tshuva, I think we need to give some context
Mhm.
in terms of chametz. What is chametz is leavened wheat, right? From the Torah, if a person takes bread, an ounce of bread, and eats that bread on Pesach, he gets karet. Get karet, it's a lo ta'aseh, you get karet. That's the most significant serious level.
Mhm.
If you eat bread on Pesach in a certain amount, you get karet. One level down from that is you eat a mixture of chametz and non-chametz on Pesach. And the mixture is enough to give taste, we'll say, in the halachic terms. It's enough to give taste. So you mix some chametz into something that's not chametz, and it's enough to give taste. It's still asur from the Torah, but you're not going to get karet.
Mhm.
The third level down is that you have a mixture. You have a mixture, and the amount of chametz does not give taste. And what we would say, it's batel bashishim. It's nullified by 60 amounts against it. Not enough to give taste. What is that? Is that mutad, or is that asur, or is that asur another way? So the rabbis say, according to this our approach, the rabbis say that chametz that's mixed on Pesach is asur b'mashu. Even the smallest amount, even the amount of a mustard seed, from the rabbis, that's asur. It's all asur. It matters the gradation. One you get karet for, one's a lo ta'aseh from the Torah, one's isur derabanan, and none of us want to ever transgress any of them. But it's important to have that context before we go in. So
Right.
here's the question.
And so I guess the issue is going to be is, when is this bittul b'shishim taking place? Is it
Exactly.
prior to Pesach or is it on Pesach?
Exactly. So no one's going to allow you in this halakha to be mevatel on Pesach any chametz, because the rabbis say that chametz that's mitarev on Pesach is asur bekolshu. It's asur in the smallest amount. Right. The question that Chacham Ovadia is dealing with over here is, what happens if the mixture of chametz and non-chametz happened before sunset on Pesach, right? The first day of
Right.
Pesach.
So could the chametz, which is initially batel before Pesach, it's not even something that's a forbidden flavor. Is it like a sleeper cell? And then all of a sudden it's choser v'neir, it reactivates the second Pesach begins, and then it's aser b'mashehu. That's our
Exactly.
problem here.
That is the question. You hit it on the nose. The issue is, once it's batel before the holiday, again, as a reminder, it's never allowed to be batel on the holiday. But before the holiday, once it's nullified, does it reawaken, like you say, a sleeper cell, right? Does it reawaken like the second Pesach starts, because the rabbis and the Torah was so serious about chametz? Does it all of a sudden attain its own chashivut, its own importance, that even if it was nullified, it reawakens? And that's exactly what the question that he deals with.
All right, so break it down for us. So what's Rav Ovadia's approach to this? What's his answer?
So he starts out in the Yechaveh Da'as for quoting a rabbi from the 13th century in Navurda, which is close to France. He says, "Besefer HaMechtam," which is a perush of Rishon on Masechet Pesachim. He says, "Katav she'af al pi she'ta'arovet chametz b'Pesach oseret b'mashu," that even though, as we just said, a mixture on Pesach is osed, is prohibited even in the smallest amount. Mikol makom, nevertheless, it gets mixed in on the 14th day of Nisan, which is still not the holiday. Even though it's after the Chatzot, even though it's after Le'achar Zman Isuroch Shel Chametz, it's still not the holiday. Vehu pachot meshishim. It's less than 60th. And we know, according to many areas of halakha, that if, let's say, pig falls into non-kosher food falls into kosher food, we have this concept of batel bashishim. It's nullified in 60. So the rabbis made this calculation in the Gemara that the way to nullify a taste is to have 60. Why is it not 40? Why is it not 100? It doesn't matter right now. But if you have 60 against it, it nullifies its taste. And there's not enough of the chametz to give taste in the mixture. Mutar le'ochlo, you can eat it. Afilu le'vel Pesach, even on the night of the Seder. Or le'maharat, even the next day. Ve'en lomar hare achshav nichnas bizmano she'oser b'mashu. We don't say that just because it's asur now in the smallest amount of mashu. We say shekevan shenitpatel once it becomes nullified. Kvad lifnei Pesach, when it was mutar to eat. Everybody's allowed to eat chametz up until Pesach. We say eno chozer v'niur b'Pesach. It does not reawaken. It does not reawaken. If we go down a few lines, the fourth to last word on the line is Umaran Bet Yosef. Maran is Maran Yosef Karo. He wrote the Bet Yosef, and later on the Shulchan Aruch and many other Sephardim. Umaran Bet Yosef Sham He'etik Ma Shekatav Rashi B'Tshuva. The Shulchan Aruch quotes Rashi. He says the following: Basar Yavesh, dried meat, Shelo Nizhar B'Mlichato, that you were not careful what kind of salt you were using. You salted meat during the regular part of the year that was not Pesach. V'chein gvinan, so too cheese. Mutar le'echol otam ba'Pesach. Rashi says you can eat them on Pesach. Salted meat, cheese. Why? She'af al pi shechametz ba'Pesach oseh b'mashu, even though chametz on the holiday is asur in the smallest amount. Zeu she'nimsa chametz ba'ayin betoch ha'Pesach. That's when it's on the holiday itself. Sheyesh l'konsol, that the rabbis penalized you because you had it in your property. Aval, and I'll finish with this in a second. Aval b'ta'arovet kodem ha'Pesach b'nidonenu, but in the mixture that happened before the holiday started, when you weren't careful with the meat or the cheese, and it's possible maybe it was salted with some salt that came in contact with some chametz. It's only asur if the ratio was not 60 against it.
Right. And so one other thing interesting that he points out, he quotes the Shulchan Aruch, which of course he's going to quote the Shulchan Aruch, right? He makes a big point about that at the end of the tshuva. We'll get to that soon. Is that if everything takes place before Pesach, we're fine. It's Eino Chozer V'Neor. But the issue is when you have like Kavash Kamavushal and you are soaking something in a Chametz Stika Kli, it might be Bolim Ba Pesach. It might actually be absorbing the flavor on Pesach. But then he brings up a very important consideration, which isn't just, of course, limited to Hilchos Pesach. I mean, Hilchos Kashrus is you generally derive much. In Yoreh De'ah, they refer you back to Hilchos Pesach to learn all the laws of Hachsharas Kalim. So he brings up the idea of Stam Kalim Eina B'nei Yoman. Do you want to just speak about that briefly?
Well, this is where even within Sephardi poskim, you'll have people who take the strict approach and people take the lenient approach. Here's the deal. If you're soaking fish in a kli that was not koshered for Pesach, you can say that the chametz that's balua, that's absorbed into the sholet, into the walls of the pot, will leave the walls of the pot and go into the fish. But Chacham Ovadia says the following. We say stam kelim ena b'nei yomam, that if you have a keli that you don't know for sure that you used it within the last 24 hours, we consider it as not within 24 hours, and then anything that's absorbed into the walls of the keli are not going to give it a good taste. I mean, you leave milk out for 24 hours, it's not going to taste good. So I have a good piece of cheesecake, it's not gonna taste good. So he uses the opinion of Stam Kelim Ena B'nei Yoman, that if you didn't know when it came to the meat or the cheese, or it comes, the Geonim quote, oil or honey, and you didn't know for sure that they used the keli within 24 hours, then you can say that we adopt the approach that it wasn't used within 24 hours. And extraordinary repercussions for this analysis. And there's many tshuvot written about it. I mean, he also mentions that a way through this is to look at this entire concept as a safek de Rabbanan lekula.
Right.
Since Chametz on Pesach is asur b'mashu midirabanan, as we introduced, the small amount of Chametz on Pesach is asur from the rabbis. We have a rule safek de Rabbanan lekula. He also quotes the Rif and the Rosh. He also quotes Maran ben Habib that uses different types of safek safekot. I'm not sure if your listeners know what a safek safekah is, and I'm not sure we have time. We're running out of time. But a safek safekah is a double safek, which we could get into, and he uses all of these.
And that's Rav Ovadia Lishitasa. Rav Ovadia loves using svekas to be matter things, just to bring it. But I think I think what I want to get to is, okay, so unsurprisingly, Rav Ovadia Yosef adopts what we might call a more I don't want to say common sense approach, because then it kind of implies the other side is not common sense, but a pragmatic approach, unsurprisingly more lenient. And then, of course, he has to address Achenu ha'ashkenazim. And this really, the latter part of the tshuva, I find absolutely fascinating. I picked a few quotes from here. He says, "V'gam ibnei edus hamizrach yesh chasidim va'anshe ma'isa hamachmir ma'az b'chol zeh." Even amongst the Sephardim, there are some who say, I think he actually quotes the Kaf HaChaim, who takes this approach, Shela Inyan Pesach anu Ashkenazim. When it comes to Pesach, we're Ashkenazi, which you're like, wait, isn't that like the whole point of being Sephardi, is that you get to be lenient on Pesach? You're like losing, I mean, you still get to eat more flavorful food, I guess, in the end of the day. You get better recipes, but he kind of like develops this approach to how a posek should go about developing policy for his community versus for himself. And I was wondering if you could speak about that a little bit.
Yeah, this was one of the most meaningful points as a young rabbi learning in Kollel, to read this teshuvah at the second half of it. He says the following: Ulam harav hamore hora'al rabim, a rabbi who is teaching the public. Sarich lehorot kedat maran shkibalnu horotav ben lehakel ben le'achmir. He has to teach according to the laws of Maran Shulchan Aruch, whether they're lenient or strict. And he says later on, if a rabbi wants to adopt a strict approach, he has to do that in private. This is extraordinary because Pesach we take seriously. Nobody wants to transgress a law of the Torah and get karet. I get it. I understand it. And we want to be extra special careful to make sure we're all adopting a passionate, committed approach to halakha. But at the same time, are the leadership allowed to adopt an Ashkenazi approach when they're teaching Sephardi students? This is an extraordinary thing. We have Sephardic Jews all around the world. A lot of them go to Ashkenazi yeshivot, and we adopt the Ashkenazi approach, which I myself did in my own years. But at the end of the day, if you're going to become a rabbi and your population is Sephardi, you need to stick to the words of Rav Ovadia Yosef, who sticks to the words of Maran Shulchan Aruch, whether it's lenient or strict. So that means that every rabbi in the next 3 weeks, Sephardi rabbi, is going to get, I guarantee you, loads of WhatsApps and texts and Instagrams asking them questions from people, men and women or children, cooking in the kitchen. What do I do? And this tshuva has extraordinary repercussions.
100%. And there are a few interesting, the whole paragraph honestly is worth reading, but we're limited on time. So a few pull quotes. He quotes the pasuk, Al tihi tzaddik harbe, don't be overly righteous. And also toward the end, he quotes the tshuva me'ahava, which his formulation is remarkable, I think. He says, Misha shagag v'hor la sur lachem shelo kedin. Let's say you didn't know the halacha. Why was Rav Ovadia Yosef able to be makel in many cases? Because he actually knew. He had encyclopedic knowledge. I think I was reading in a biography, he lamented that many younger rabbis who were less knowledgeable the reason they paskin lahachmir many issues because they just weren't aware of the legitimate makel positions. It means they didn't do their due diligence. And so someone who's machmir shelo kedin, chamor oncho memisha shagvahor lahakel shelo kedin. It's worse than pasking lahakel, leniently shelo kedin. Because one, he says, is a violation being adam lamako, between the person and God, and that is something that could be healed more easily. But whereas ruling lahachmir when that's not necessary is a violation of being adam lechavero interpersonally, shafilu yom kippurim eno mechaper, without the mechila and forgiveness of that individual. I'm just like, whoa, that's like a real paradigm shift there.
Do you know how much food is thrown out? Because the rabbi says, asur, throw it out, start over. And at the end of the day, that's a ben adam lahavero situation, because he was machmir, and it's better to be makil, because so the person has to make it up with God. It's extraordinary quote from the Teshuvah Me'aba. It really gives you a sense of how great Chacham Ovadia was. I am nobody to comment on Chacham Ovadia. I am the most knowledgeable of all. But it's so beautiful to have him represent our Keilah, the Sephardim, all around the world. He's passed, it's been a while since his passing, 2013, but we still feel him very, very much alive every day when we read his tshuvot, when we read his halachot, and they're all over, they're translated into English, into different languages. He was a bastion of hope and of pride for Sephardim all around the world.
Right. And I want to just 2 points to end off with. And then, of course, if there's anything you want to leave our listeners with. One is, so just circling back to the more localized question of the tshuva. So can we just clarify in one line? So what is the psak of Rav Ovadia on the shaila that we had at hand about products that were seemingly kosher lePesach, but weren't given special supervision before? And what's his bottom line on this one? And then the second question afterwards I want to ask you is, Rav Ovadia mentioned that we have to stick to the Shulchan Aruch, bein lahakel, bein lahachmir. Oftentimes, we hear a lot about these Sephardic kulos. Maybe you want to share with our listeners, I'm sure we have many Ashkenazi listeners, what are some chumras that Ashkenazim don't really think about when they are, campaigning to take on all the kulas of the Sephardic world?
Both good questions. So I'll start with your first question. The first question is, ask your local rabbi. Meaning, when you're going shopping, it might just be easier to follow the kashrus organizations and make sure that you're getting everything up to date, double, triple check, because we don't want to make a mistake. But in a situation when, let's say, you can't, seems according to Chacham Ovadia in many places that if something is cooked before the Pesach and there's no chametz, that got intermingled or mixture, and it's you assume that it was just, let's say, honey that was produced in the fields, and you have that on Pesach. Chacham Ovadia would say that honey, oil, pure sugar, those things that have no reasonable reason to have a mixture of chametz in it would be allowed.
Okay, that's good.
That goes for many products, but I'll say, look, ask your local rabbi and make sure.
And even Ashkenazim, my understanding is, there's a difference between maybe something which is yavesh versus lach. That's why you'll see many kashrus organizations, which, as you said, there's the Ashkenazi hegemony that's ruling over it. They, something like milk, buying it before Pesach. Should there be any very distant rachuk concern of something chametz stick getting in, buying it before Pesach, making sure it was made before Pesach, that solves that issue, because when it comes to davar lach, they aren't as conservative.
Chacham Ovadia says many times that when in doubt, buy it before Pesach. So we know that it was nullified beforehand. I mean, there's some really interesting points here. Is like he asks a question, well, let's say it wasn't 60 against it before Pesach. Can we add more? Can we add more to make?
Oh, right. So it wouldn't be a mevalan isser l'chadchila because it's not yet isser. It's not yet forbidden.
Right. Correct. That's correct. Do you have to know about the nullification before the holiday? And he says, no, you don't have to know about it beforehand, because you would think that you'd have to know. You'd have to have an awareness. No, the insight he has into the halachic system is extraordinary. In terms of your second question,
I
I'm
know that
not
one came a
sure.
little bit out of left field, but I
That came
I
out
just
of
saw that line and I had to ask.
That's a good question. I would have to get back to your listeners on that. I'm not sure.
It's just great
What
to be a Sephardi, right? That's really just the conclusion. There's no downside.
I pray that in the very, very short future, meaning tomorrow, we will all be in Eretz HaKodesh, Sephardim, Ashkenazim, Temanim, Moroccaim, all different colors, all under the same Tachat Kanfei HaShekhinah, the wings of heaven, protected by God, safe and sound, back in our homeland.
Amen. And whether we are all going to be following Sephardic halacha when we move to Eretz Yisrael, of course, is a topic of another tshuva of Rav Ovadia. So we'll have to wait until next time to analyze that
Happy
one.
to be back.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Haber, for your time and for your insights, and wishing you and your entire kahila, God willing, a chag kosher v'sameach.
The school is Shemna Bot Ne'imot V'Tavot.